Chosen one. There is a dimension of spiritual experience that does not announce itself in noise or spectacle. It reveals itself slowly, quietly, and often without theatrical confirmation. It emerges in the fibers of endurance, the persistence of hope, and the stubborn refusal of your soul to collapse under pressure. The world may call these characteristics personality traits, but spiritually inclined frameworks describe them differently. They describe them as indicators of assignment, subtle markers that the individual is walking under a form of protection not consciously earned, not intellectually understood, but instinctively perceived. Today, we are speaking to a truth that touches the boundary between earthly perception and invisible activity. The moment someone placed your image, your name, or your identity into prayer, that moment was not merely sentimental. It was a spiritual transaction. It was a confession that your existence demands divine oversight. Someone witnessed you withstand pressure far exceeding your resources. Someone watched as you absorbed emotional impact that should have destabilized you. Someone observed the strange resilience that followed you. And they concluded that the explanation could not be mechanical or psychological alone. In their uncertainty, they surrendered your identity upward. They took your image into the presence of God because they understood, perhaps subconsciously, that destiny must be handled by the divine. This act, chosen one, was not random. In classical theology, the presentation of a life before God symbolized acknowledgement of divine property. In psychological terms, it symbolized the relinquishing of control from the social group to transcendent authority. But beyond those frameworks lies a spiritual consequence. When the divine is petitioned regarding a person of impact, darkness reacts. Lucifer, in theological narratives, never wastes agitation on irrelevance. Rage is not a response to mediocrity. It is a reaction to threat. The enemy has always been more diagnostic than human beings. Humans debate worth. Darkness calculates it. And so, when your name passed through spiritual territory, a reaction arose. There are layers to that reaction. Some of it has shown up as inexplicable hostility toward you. Some of it has manifested as persistent misunderstanding. Some of it has emerged as recurring spiritual interference, night disturbances, emotional heaviness, and psychological fatigue. But these are not declarations of defeat. These are signs of recognition. In spiritual literature, resistance is not evidence of abandonment. It is evidence of acknowledgement. Heaven sees, darkness sees. The individual becomes the last to understand. So now, we expand upon what it means for your photograph to enter the hands of the divine. We explore the 7 layers of spiritual dynamics underlying this event. We will do it slowly, patiently, without emotional sensationalism. Only clarity, grounding, and sober understanding. Point 1. They recognized spiritual protection before you did. There is a recurring phenomenon observed in spiritually sensitive environments. Those on the outside often perceive divine protection before the protected individual becomes aware of it. You, chosen one, may not have labeled your survival as miraculous. You may have attributed endurance to personality, to coping mechanisms, or simply to the necessity of persistence. But others observed a pattern. They saw you encounter emotional collapse, yet remain functional. They saw you experience relational betrayal, yet maintain empathy. They saw you absorb psychological damage, yet retain insight. These qualities do not align with standard emotional burnout profiles. In trauma psychology, repeated exposure to emotional threat typically diminishes compassion narrows perspective and erodes trust. But you resisted that erosion. Empathy remained intact. Insight continued to expand. Something was buffering you. Others saw that. Some could not articulate it, so they called it strength. But internally, they understood it exceeded the limits of mere strength. When an individual repeatedly avoids collapse in circumstances engineered for collapse, observers instinctively label the phenomenon protected. In biblical interpretation, this echoes Psalm 91, the notion of a shield unseen. In pastoral counseling, it reflects what we call psychological elasticity beyond learned resilience. Your protection was noticed before comprehension formed. So they responded in the only spiritual language they understood. They presented your image to God. The placement of a photo or the invocation of a name signifies intercession. Intercession is not merely asking for rescue. It is recognizing value. Intercessors do not pray over the disposable. They pray over the instrumental. They pray over the person whose existence influences their emotional equilibrium. They pray over the life that inexplicably affects the atmosphere of a room. What they saw in you, even before you understood it, was continuity. You continued. You endured. You stabilized. And so, they concluded that heaven must be shielding you. They were not mistaken. Point 2. Your identity was handed to prayer. Because logic failed. When the mind reaches the boundary of comprehension, it seeks a higher interpretive authority. This is seen across religions, across psychology, and across generational behavior. The moment someone handed your identity into prayer, they were admitting something. Your life is not explainable under ordinary cause and effect. They saw outcomes inconsistent with probability. You survived decisions that should have cost you more than they did. You walked away from interpersonal damage without psychological paralysis. You retrieved dignity from betrayal. You retrieved self-worth from abandonment. In purely clinical terms, this trajectory contradicts standard developmental mapping. Individuals with repeated social trauma typically struggle with self-referencing beliefs, identity dysmorphia, and attachment distortion. Yet you maintained an internal compass. That confused observers. When confusion meets spiritual cultural training, the impulse becomes prayer. Prayer is the cognitive mechanism humans use to outsource incomprehensible variables. It is the admission that analysis has failed. So they brought your image to God, not solely out of care, but out of bewilderment. They could not calculate your equilibrium. They could not interpret your calm. They could not understand your refusal to collapse. And underlying that confusion was fear. Human beings fear anomalies. The unfamiliar provokes anxiety. Instead of confronting anxiety, they outsource it to God. That is what they did with you. Your life was handed to divine evaluation. That action transferred perception from human critique to divine sovereign oversight. They were saying without language, "We do not understand this one, so we must hand them over." Point 3. Darkness reacts to assignment, not personality. Lucifer does not rage against personality traits. Darkness does not expend resources attacking aesthetics. Spiritual opposition organizes itself around assignment, the potential of a person to disrupt entrenched patterns of despair. You, chosen one, carry disruption. You interrupt emotional decay. You interrupt generational programming. You interrupt psychological stagnation. These interruptions are not loud. They are subtle. People heal faster around you. People speak differently around you. People reevaluate themselves in your presence. This is what spiritual frameworks call influence. In demonic strategy, influence is dangerous. Influence converts environments. Influence reconfigures outcomes. Therefore, rage is allocated proportionally to influence. You took blows early in life not because you were weak, but because systems of darkness attempt preemption. They target potential before potential becomes structure. Your anxiety spikes did not appear because you were fragile. They appeared because fragility was being engineered around you so your assignment would never activate. But the engineering failed. You kept developing. You kept reflecting. You kept self-correcting. This refusal to stagnate made you a psychological anomaly. When your picture entered the realm of spiritual engagement, darkness reacted with agitation, not because the act itself was threatening, but because intercession confirmed classification. You were no longer an unregistered target. You were categorized by heaven. In adversarial frameworks, that classification provokes rage. Rage is a concession that a strategy failed. Point 4. A chosen life disrupts generational momentum. Most individuals replicate their lineage. Behavioral science documents that trauma transmits across generations. Dysfunction replicates itself through modeling, but you, chosen one, represent interruption. You stepped into the chain of generational momentum and refused its continuation. You questioned beliefs. You questioned emotional norms. You questioned relational patterns. You refused to normalize disrespect. You refused to normalize silence. You refused to normalize despair. This refusal was not encouraged. Families rarely celebrate disruptors. Communities rarely applaud divergence. Social ecosystems crave predictability. But you did not comply. Your deviation marked you as a risk factor. In spiritual warfare frameworks, intergenerational disruption is treated as hostility. Darkness invests in continuity, pain passed forward, shame inherited, silence maintained. When a single life refuses that inheritance, the chain fractures. You became that fracture. So when someone handed your existence to God, the enemy reacted. Generational disruption exposes future conversions. If you change, children change. If you heal, the lineage heals. Healing has multiplicative consequences. That multiplicative potential produced rage. Rage, in adversarial psychology, is panic disguised. Point 5. Being mentioned in prayer marks. Transfer of authority. When your image entered prayer, something administrative occurred in the spiritual sense. Jurisdiction shifted. In religious language, to present someone to God is to acknowledge divine ownership. Ownership shifts emotional power, because the moment a soul is submitted to something greater, the chain of manipulation is quietly broken. Those who once relied on emotional access, fear, guilt, shame, or obligation, find their tools suddenly dull. Their psychological advantage evaporates. A spiritual boundary forms. If people wanted to manipulate you before, they lost leverage in that moment. Because once a life is placed before God, influence becomes monitored. Human intention does not operate freely on a consecrated identity. Attempts at psychological control undergo spiritual restriction. Pressure no longer produces obedience. Accusation no longer generates self-doubt. That is why certain individuals suddenly found it harder to pressure you. It is why guilt stopped working on you. It is why shame lost persuasive power. What once tightened around your self-worth can no longer grip because it no longer has permission. Divine jurisdiction complicates manipulation, not through force, but through sovereignty. When authority changes hands, access becomes regulated, and darkness understands jurisdiction. Lucifer, depicted scripturally as a legal adversary, reacts most violently to loss of claim. His fury is not emotional, it is procedural. Scripture frames him as the accuser, a being who depends on legal access in the spiritual imagination. When that access is revoked, rage follows. The rage you felt spiritually was not personal. It was administrative. A claim expired. A life transferred departments. A new system of accountability began. Your identity was filed under divine supervision. Your psychological processing began to align with something higher than approval and acceptance. That alone alters the architecture of influence. In human relational dynamics, this looks like separation. Social circles change. Relationships fall away. The gravitational pull of certain personalities dissolves. People who once intimidated you emotionally can no longer trigger the same reflexes. Control collapses because the emotional material they used, fear of abandonment, fear of judgment, fear of rejection, has been neutralized. Emotional intimidation stops yielding compliance. The former currency of influence, guilt, shame, obligation, becomes worthless in a divine economy. You stop being persuadable. You stop negotiating your worth. You stop treating other people's approval as a life support system. That is jurisdictional transfer. It is not loud. It is not dramatic. It is administrative, invisible, and absolute. You were moved from one category of psychological ownership to another, from human supervision to divine guardianship. And once that shift occurs, nothing manipulative can operate without detection. Point 6. Rage intensifies. When destiny nears completion, there is a psychological principle. Resistance increases near structural breakthrough. Muscle fibers tremble harder before strengthening. Anxiety spikes before cognitive reframing. The nervous system resists new interpretation until the old pattern collapses. Darkness follows the same pattern. Spiritual agitation increases near identity consolidation because the psyche senses that an old version of self is dissolving. The ego resists replacement. That is why the most intense emotional battles did not occur in your weakest years. They occurred near transformation. When your clarity improved, battles increased. When your confidence stabilized, disruption intensified. Not because you were losing, because you were nearing establishment. Establishment is the psychological state where doubt no longer overrules conviction. Once a person stabilizes in conviction, manipulation becomes impossible. The enemy fears impossibility. Lucifer's rage was never about your past. It was about your nearing completion. Completion creates a threat environment because instability can be exploited, but stability cannot. When a mind has not yet decided who it is, fear can redirect it. But once identity locks into place, once the internal narrative becomes non-negotiable, fear loses its function. Everything you have been experiencing emotionally has been the final resistance of a system that can no longer contain who you are becoming. Think of a rocket at liftoff. The most violent shaking happens closest to separation, not because the vehicle is failing, but because it is detaching. You are detaching from a life you outgrew. Emotional turbulence has marked your exit from uncertainty. Psychological research calls this homeostasis disruption. The discomfort that rises when stability is about to reorganize into a higher order. What you felt as anxiety, doubt, or spiritual attack was the final friction of a life that no longer fits your architecture. You were shedding. You were molting. Each attack was an indicator of imminence. The pressure you faced was proportional to your internal alignment. When a person becomes internally aligned, belief, behavior, purpose, and self-concept unified, external forces have nothing to attach to. There is no emotional Velcro left. That is what frightened the enemy. You were becoming emotionally non-reactive, spiritually principled, and psychologically stable. You were nearing completion, and completion creates a threat because a finished foundation cannot be invaded. You no longer seek permission. You no longer require applause. You no longer collapse to intimidation. Manipulation depends on insecurity, but once conviction becomes self-sustaining, warfare becomes irrelevant. That is why disruption erupted. It was not evidence of failure. It was a notification of arrival. You are at the doorway of the establishment, where identity is sealed, purpose becomes operational, and opposition loses strategy. Point 7. Your photo before God became evidence of heavenly ownership. In spiritual symbolism, imagery has legal meaning. To place your picture before God was to acknowledge, this life belongs to higher supervision. That act documented you spiritually. Documentation changes status. Once archived in heavenly perception, you ceased to be anonymous. Your identity became referenced. Angels observe. Protection activates. Darkness receives notification. That notification is what provoked rage. You were no longer unclaimed territory. You were recorded properly. In adversarial frameworks, once a life is claimed, demonic influence loses direct jurisdiction. It must negotiate. Negotiation is costly. Rage was the response. But rage is not dominance. Rage is concession. Rage is the scream of expired ownership. Rage is the reaction of spiritual irrelevance. Rage means you are no longer accessible as before. Rage means the file has been closed. Rage means heaven has initiated custody, and custody is irrevocable. Having said this, chosen one, your journey continues. But let us deepen this truth. In ancient spiritual traditions, the transfer of representation was never symbolic affection. It was a legal shift of oversight. Kings stamped documents to signify protection. Priests anointed objects to signify separation. Families marked gates with blood to establish a boundary. When your image was presented before God, that boundary was drawn around your existence. This was not emotional approval. It was spiritual escrow. Heaven became the trustee of your development. Every threat, every pressure, every destabilization attempt now required heavenly review. To darkness, which represents a catastrophic administrative barrier. Hell survives through accessibility, psychological intrusion, emotional manipulation, and fearful suggestion. When a life becomes documented, intrusion is blocked by classification. You are labeled restricted. You are labeled under divine process. You are labeled monitored for purpose. The enemy does not rage because it has power. It rages because it has lost efficiency. It rages because its old tactics have been logged, recognized, and neutralized. Rage rises when strategy collapses. Rage rises when a former victim becomes immune. Rage rises when access expires. Understand, chosen one. Spiritual rage is never about who you are. It is about what darkness can no longer do to you. When Lucifer screams, it is not because he has authority, but because he has lost methodology. He has lost secrecy. He has lost influence. Every scream is a confession that your life has become inconvenient to corruption. Your path is now regulated by higher intelligence. Your decisions are being refined under supervision. Your growth is being preserved by covenant. So yes, custody is irrevocable, but custody also means development. Protection is never passive. It is purposeful. You are not merely guarded. You are prepared. Having said this, chosen one, your journey continues. And so, chosen one, you should understand something with absolute clarity. Nothing occurring in your life is random anymore. Nothing unfolding in your inner world is accidental. The resistance you have experienced was never proof of spiritual neglect. It was proof of spiritual confirmation. The agitation you have felt was not a sign that darkness is overpowering you. It was a sign that darkness has been forced to accept that it cannot reclaim you. Your name has already been spoken in the courts of heaven. Your identity has already been placed under review by divine governance. The outcome has already been settled. You remain under protection that does not fluctuate with mood or human loyalty. You remain under observation that does not depend on performance or perfection. You remain under a purpose that does not expire simply because doubt visited your mind. The storms you survived are now data in your spiritual record. The disappointments you endured have become evidence. The betrayals you suffered have become testimony. Those who attempted to mark you with shame only certified your spiritual legitimacy. Those who tried to speak against you only confirmed that your life carries weight. Destiny does not provoke neutrality. Heaven marking you was not an emotional event. It was the quiet sealing of identity. You belong to a realm that intends to finish what it started. Even now, whether you feel certainty or uncertainty, movement or stillness, emotional strength or temporary fatigue, your journey is guided. You are not unclaimed. You are not unseen. You are not wandering without surveillance. That photograph, whether literal or symbolic, became your declaration of ownership. Heaven knows who you are. The enemy knows who you are. You are simply catching up. Move forward in steadiness. Move forward with dignity. Move forward without the need for visible applause or human permission. The seal is already placed. The record is already stored. And the rage of darkness is already defeated by the inevitability of your becoming. Rest in that. Walk in that. And let the quiet certainty of your spirit remind you, your story was never in their hands. It has always and only belonged to God.